If you're mixing or mastering a project for digital release, you can do pretty much whatever you want. But if you're mixing or mastering a project for vinyl release, you need to know the limitations of vinyl in order to get the best fidelity out of your pressing. In this video, I'm going to show you the what and the why of those limitations. When mixing for vinyl, there are a few things you need to keep an eye on. When mixing, it's best to contain the issues while you're mixing rather than relying on the mastering process to fix them. The first of these deals with low-frequency phase relationships. And to understand why this is an issue, let's take a look at how a lathe cutter head works. The cutter head cuts on a 45-degree angle. So first I'm going to show you the left channel. And this is how the right channel cuts. So you would think that if you had a mono signal or a center signal, that the cutter head would move vertically, but it doesn't. The left and right channels are actually driven 180 degrees out of phase. This gives a more lateral motion. Now this is good because there's more surface area on the disc than there is depth to the lacquer. And this is where low frequency, out of phase material in your mix will cause problems, because the cutter head will flip the signal back into phase and the stylus will have a strong vertical motion, which will cause it to either jump out of the lacquer or dig down into the aluminum, which is bad. Now, one way that mastering engineers deal with low-frequency information being out of phase is they put it through something called an elliptical equalizer. Now, an elliptical equalizer is a filter that basically sums all the low-frequency information in your mix to mono. Now, this isn't always desirable and it's not always necessary. So it's best to check your mix while you're mixing to make sure that the low end is good. And the way that you can do this is there's two different ways. One way is to use a phase meter. And the phase meter I like to use is this one by Flux. It's free, it's great. The other thing you can do is when you're monitoring, listen in mono and go back and forth and listen between stereo and mono. Now, when you listen to a stereo mix in mono, there's going to be some loss in the mid-range and upper frequencies of random phase information. And this is usually in the form of ambience or reverbs or choruses. But what you're really looking for is you want to listen to the low end. And when you switch to mono, the low end really shouldn't shift. If you hear a dip in the low frequencies, you've got to go through your mix and find out where and why this is happening. Now, this can be caused by a couple different things. One of them is choruses and flangers will frequently do it. And the other thing is when you use multiple mics on a single instrument. Piano and drums are the most common cases. And in drums, what you can find is you may not have noticed that, your left tom mic is out of phase with your right overhead. And so what you need to do is go through, check your mix for low frequency out of phase information, fix it in the mix before you send it to the mastering engineer. All right, now the next thing to keep an eye on is sibilance. Now, sibilance causes a problem for two different reasons. And to understand the first reason, we've got to look at what your phono preamp looks like on playback. All phono preamps have an RIAA equalizer that looks something like this. And as you can see, there's a steep cut in the high frequencies and a boost in the low frequencies. But when you're cutting a disc, it actually has the complementary equalization. So there's actually a boost, a large boost in high frequencies and a roll-off in low frequencies. Now, this is done for two reasons. One is it gives the cutting side a lot more time because by reducing the low frequency, the grooves are smaller, but it also reduces surface noise of the disc. Here, I'm going to play this mix the way it sounds normally.
I stood around too long and watched as you break my heart.
And now with the EQ that's going to the cutter head.
So you can see how a large high frequency burst could be a problem. But there's a second reason, and it has to do with the stylus tracking. Now, in this animation, you can see a very exaggerated approximation of cutting a groove. And at the beginning, it's normal music information. But then what you see is a burst of high frequency information that's similar to sibilance. And you can see how difficult it is for the cutter head to actually track and cut this groove. But it's even worse when you play it back on your turntable, because most tone arms and styluses are not going to be able to track that groove properly, which is going to result in distortion. Now, mastering engineers can deal with sibilance to some degree. They have some pretty incredible limiters called acceleration limiters that will help tame this. But again, it's still best to try to tame it in your mix before you give it to the mastering engineer.
As far as digital limiting goes, I would remove it or greatly reduce it for the mix that you send to the vinyl mastering engineer. I hate the loudness wars, but that's not the point. The cutter head in a lathe runs very hot. They have thermal circuit breakers that will shut them off at 200 degrees centigrade. So if you send a heavily limited mix for mastering, what's going to happen is it's going to increase the average power to the cutter head, which could cause it to overheat. So for that reason, the mastering engineer is going to actually turn the level down on something that's heavily limited.
The third thing that you need to keep an eye on when you're doing a vinyl release is time, how long your sides are. Now, the grooves, as you can see in this picture, are absolutely tiny. But nevertheless, it adds up, and only so many grooves can fit on the side of a record. Now, the optimum time is generally around 17 minutes per side. If you exceed 17 minutes per side, the mastering engineer is going to have to do one of two things: either reduce the level or roll off low frequency. So it's good to really balance the sides and get them as equal as possible. When I was engineering and vinyl was the predominant release, we took great care also in sequencing, how far apart the songs were exactly. You know, in this day and age where we have sort of shuffle play for every player, we treated the album as a whole piece. And it should sort of go through phases and changes, you know, and end somewhere. It was almost like treating the songs as movements in a classical piece. So we would experiment a great deal moving the songs around to get them just in the right order and to get the side lengths exactly what we wanted. The other aspect of, you know, vinyl, which is a great limitation, is time, is the fact that there isn't that much time. You need to be musically concise. You know, I think one of the, when I was working with Phil Ramone, one of the big pleasures was almost all artists, we would cut 12, 14 songs. But generally, we can only fit 10 on a vinyl release. So right at the completion of the record, right when we were figuring out the sequencing, what we would do is we would throw out 3 or 4 songs. So we were left with the 10 best. And it was really kind of exciting to hear that final sequence for the first time, because we'd always been working on the songs individually. So figuring out your timing, your sequencing, try to not go too much over 17 minutes a side. This will all make for a better vinyl release and kind of give you that old school feel, one of those things that you couldn't put your finger on that you liked about vinyl records that has sort of been lost, you know, in the CD and streaming era. I would also suggest you go to a mastering engineer. If you're going to spend the money to print vinyl, as you can see, a lot of these decisions in order to optimize the cutting of the record are taste. And I don't believe an algorithm's going to do it. And I think that if you send a vinyl, something to be cut and stamped at a pressing plant, they're going to use the most conservative settings. They'll cut the level, they'll mono the low end, they'll have the de-esser hitting hard. But if you send it to somebody with ears and sits there and analyze it, and his goal is to make it sound as good as it possibly can before it hits the cutter head, that's really where you want to spend the money. Otherwise, I think you're kind of cheating yourself. If you enjoyed this video at all, I'm going to be adding a Patreon link below. Please click subscribe, and see you next time.